right, so this is going to be a walkthrough of classification or taxonomy, which is the science of grouping and naming organisms. So we're going to start by discussing how do we name organisms and how do we group organisms. So you may remember this goes all the way back to the beginning of the year. Binomial nomenclature means a to name, bi means to, and nomial name, and nomenclature means a system of naming. So we use a to-name system to name organisms. Why do we do this? Because, for one thing, and you can see this in the example, puma, cougar, and mountain lion are all regional common names for the same exact animal. So because people might call organisms by different names depending on where they live, scientists came up with a method by which every organism would have a universal name. And so that universal name is the genus and the species of the organism. If you see it printed, and you're going to see scientific names on the AP exam, it's a guarantee. They always will say, Drosophila melanogaster, the common fruit fly. And so you'll see they'll name these things, and you really don't need to worry about understanding what the meanings of their names are, but you should recognize that if you see something in italics, it's their scientific name. Very often you'll see that they'll be discussing, for example, the relationship between several organisms that belong to the same genus. Like in this case, Felis is the genus, but different species. And it'll be some experiment where they're discussing the differences between the different species. So, this is a scientific name. Again, it's the genus and the species of the organism. The genus usually is capitalized, and the species is lowercase. If you see it printed, like on a test, it would be in italics. If you're writing it by hand, you should underline it. That's the appropriate way of writing it. So how do they get these scientific names? Like I said, it's the genus and the species. So these are the levels. You may remember this from the beginning of the year. The most general level is the domain. So for example, our domain is Eukarya, but you may remember there was also Archaea and Bacteria. Those were the two other domains. So everything belongs to one of three domains. And then within the domain, we have our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The further you go here, the more specific we get. In order for two organisms to be considered the same species, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about evolution next week, they have to live together and be able to mate and make fertile offspring together. And if they can do that, then they're considered the same species. So, for example, the Felis concolor, the panther, and the Felis domesticus, the house cat, would not be considered the same species because, at least in nature, they don't mate with one another and make fertile offspring. You might say, well, what about like dogs and wolves? They are separate species. Yes, if you put a dog and a wolf in an environment, you probably can get them to mate. I know that there are hybrid dog wolves, and they are fertile. But even if they don't mate just because behaviorally they don't come in contact with each other and mate, they're still considered separate species. Okay, so how do we decide that humans are more closely related to mushrooms than flowers, for example? We use a lot of evidence. Probably what we relied on more a long time ago would have been morphological evidence, meaning, for example, similar bone structures, similar features, the location of the eyes, the number of legs, things like that. However, today we've added to this and made it better, because today we use a lot more biochemical and molecular evidence, meaning we can actually, for example, feed DNA into computers, and then the computer will basically spit back. For a great example of this is you could go online, and there's government websites where they basically just have banks of DNA, and you could type in the scientific name for cow, pig, horse, and human, and type in a particular gene. Let's just say the gene for hemoglobin. And it would spit back to you the exact amino acids for the codes of all of those organisms, and it would even highlight what they have in common and what they have different. And if you recall, when we just talked about genetics and electrophoresis and all of that, that the more DNA, what we would think is the more DNA they have in common with one another, then probably the more related they are. And they can even sort of build a family tree, it looks like there was a deletion in this section of DNA, and there was an insertion here, and there was a frame shift at this point. And they can actually build these trees. Now, why is DNA evidence better than morphological evidence? Well, keep in mind, we do still use morphological evidence, but this picture kind of shows you a reason why sometimes morphological evidence could steer us wrong. So on first glance, if you were to see one of these eastern glass lizards, you might think it was a snake. And it's not. It is actually a legless lizard. And down here is the snake. And you'll notice that we don't believe, in this case, that we had some kind of an ancestor and there was a mutation where it lost its legs, and then that diverged into the glass lizard and the snake. That's not what we think happened in this case. So what this tree is showing is that some mutation happened that, yes, there was a loss of limbs, and that led to snakes, and a separate, unrelated mutation happened over here, and that led to the eastern glass lizard, which is actually a lizard. It has other morphological features that make it fit better with a lizard than with a snake. So what do we call that? Well, if there are structures that are, they have the same function, or maybe they look similar, but they're not from an evolutionary relationship, that it didn't happen as a result of evolution, those are called analogous structures. Not as opposed to, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, homologous structures. Homologous structures did come from evolution, that a common ancestor had those structures, and that led to these organisms that exist today. So analogous structures may serve the same function, they may even appear the same on the outside, but they're not actually a result of evolution. So what would lead both of these organisms to not have legs? Something called convergent evolution. I think I have a better definition of that here. In other words, in some cases, and in this case, you have two moles here. The one on top is an Australian mole, and the one on the bottom is the North American mole. Now, they have some features in common. They both have small eyes. They both have big noses. They both have very large front claws. But evolution tells us, morphological evidence, biochemical evidence, etc., shows us that they did not come from a common ancestor with small eyes and big claws and big noses. This would be an example of convergent evolution. In other words, they both lived in areas, perhaps dark areas, where there was a lot of dirt, and the food that they ate was insects, and so having a big nose was favored. Having small eyes was favored. Having large claws was favored. And so they both ended up with these similar structures independently by completely separate mutations that had nothing to do with one another. And so that's called convergent evolution. So sometimes morphological evidence is not always the best. And here's another example of convergent evolution. These animals all have very similar adaptations. The giant armadillo, the pangolin, and the anteaters, they all have long, skinny noses. But again, evidence does not support that they came from a common ancestor with a long nose that then diverged into these different groups. They all just eat the same things, probably live in very similar environments, and so evolution supported the development of these structures by random chance, natural selection, mutations, and all of that stuff, but independently. Sometimes we do see organisms that came from a common ancestor. For example, the ostrich and the emu. I believe ostriches are here, and I don't remember if emus are South America or Australia, but the ostrich and the emu, we do believe, came from two fat, flightless birds that diverged from one another. And so in some cases, yes, it may be that the evidence supports that they did come from a common ancestor, and sometimes they did not. So just something to know. This is showing a picture of how computers can analyze DNA, which gives us great information. It would take a scientist way too long to try to plug all this DNA down and then start reading it and try to find what do they have in common, what do they not have in common. But computers can do this very quickly. So if we feed a DNA sample into a computer, it can basically spit back and tell us, oh, well, these two DNA samples are from different organisms, and they're very, very similar. It looks like there was a deletion here, there was an insertion here, and then they can say, this organism has only one difference. The cow only has one difference from the horse, but it has three differences from the pig, so then they might be able to say that the cow is more closely related to the horse than the pig. Another thing that you would have to be able to do on an AP exam would be to read how closely related organisms are. And so it's really important when you're looking at these. Now this happens to be a classification showing several species and what genus they belong to. So for example, you could be asked which one is more closely related to the coyote. Would it be the wolf or the otter? Now in the picture, if you're only looking right here, it looks like they're equal, but they're not. the way that you're going to read one of these is you want to track it backwards. Where is the point at which they converge? So if you'll notice, the wolf and the coyote converge here. But if you want to converge the coyote to the otter, you have to go all the way back to here. And so this is a way that we can determine relationships. Now, here's kind of a trick question they could ask you. They could say, which is more closely related to the coyote? Would it be the otter or the badger? And your answer here is that they're equally related to the coyote, because if you track them back, they all converge here at 1. So don't make the assumption that just because the otter in the picture is closer to the coyote, it doesn't make a difference. It's how far back you have to track them, and that would determine their relationships. So this is called a phylogenetic tree. This one happens to be showing, again, the order Carnivora, splitting into several families, which then split into several genuses, and then several different species. So each branch is basically showing where they shared a common ancestor. And as we move farther back, their common ancestor goes, again, further back. So here, the leopard and the cat would be more closely related to each other than either one would be related to the wolf. But, again, they could trick you and say which one's more closely related to the wolf, and your answer would be that they're equally related to the wolf. Just because the leopard happens to be on the left side makes no difference. They both converge all the way back here, and so their relationship to the wolf would be equal. And so here's yet another picture of this. And again, this is showing where several species diverge from each other. So you'll notice here at number 5, just something I'll point out, it's actually on the take-home quiz. Scientists would probably not want to leave this way. They would want to know, because you've got 3 species that are equally related to each other. They would want to try to resolve this and figure out, did D come from E and F? Did E come from D and F, etc.? It's something that a scientist would probably want to sort out, because they're probably not exactly equally related. So just a point of reference. But again, you could be asked the question, what's more closely related? For example, D to C, or let's say D to G. Which one is more closely related? And so to answer that question, you would literally track backwards. So here's D, and I see that D, to track it back to C, I go back to 2. But to track D back to G, I have to go all the way back to 1. Therefore, D would be more closely related to C than it would be to G. Now, I did a couple problems the other day on a worksheet, so I'm going to go back over to that. All right, so we're back here at, this is the worksheet that I gave you guys. So if we look at number 1, I apologize, it's broke off a little bit. Taxon A is more closely related to C than to B, and it's a true-false question. So if I track A, we can see this is going to be false, because A and B track back to 5, but A and C, you have to track all the way back to 3 to unite A with C. So this would be false. Let's look at the second one. D is more closely related to F than to C. So here's D, and here's F. D and F track back to 4. D and C, you have to track back to 1, so that would be true. So basically, if you track them backwards and figure out at what point do they diverge, this could represent a trait. Here, trait number 8 appeared, trait number 4 appeared, trait number 1 appeared. And the closer together, or the further, I guess, back you have to go, the less related they would be. So that would just be a couple of examples of what they could ask you to do. Okay, now, you have to have some kind of an explanation of what the branches mean. You can make an assumption that 2 organisms are more closely related if the branch splits closer to the organism. But aside from that, you don't really necessarily know. Sometimes the branches are all the same length, or sometimes the branches are different lengths, for example, for time. And so I want to show you an example here. So on the bottom here, you'll notice that this time they actually have a time scale. So they could say, for example, at what point, how many million years ago did the zebrafish diverge from the human? And so what you would do is you would track it back to where the human and the zebrafish last were connected, so that would be all the way back here, and drop down. And this would probably be a multiple choice question. So, they would probably have 500 million years ago, 400 million years ago, 200 million years ago. And I would say maybe 350 or 400 million years ago would make the most sense for when they diverged from each other. But again, you can't necessarily make that assumption. For example, the one on the top, there's no scale. So we know the human and the mouse are more closely related